Today we're here to discuss pedagogical dynamics in discussion-based classes that have emerged from classes that we've taught using video conferencing technology with international colleagues. We're also interested in thinking through what kind of discussion dynamics and pedagogical techniques have worked especially well in classes that would transfer also to collaborative teaching, team teaching, and traditional single author classes. We're interested in thinking through how the advanced planning of these classes has translated into particularly rich conversational interchanges. We're also really interested in thinking through what experiences stuck out to us as most memorable and most persuasive and most powerful for our students, as well as what kinds of follow-up we did afterwards, what kinds of improvements we want to make in these classes. And we're interested in thinking through how it is that certain keywords have stuck around in our thinking about these classes as a way also of guiding future teaching as well.
I'm Carlos Rodriguez, and I'm at the Department of Music Education in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And my research focuses on musical expression and essentially a cognitive psychological perspective which looks at how humans perceive, produce, and describe musical expression over their lifetime. And Germany happens to have many scholars who are involved in the same topic. And so it was natural for me to go to Germany for conferences where I met and collaborated with various German scholars, which led me to Andreas Lehmann-Wurmser, first at the University of Bremen and now at the Hanover School of Music, Drama, and Media. And we teach together a course entitled International Perspectives in Music Education, and it covers a variety of topics that are current in the United States and in Germany with American and German students.
I'm Joshua Miller. I'm a professor in the English department. I teach 20th and 21st century American literature. The class that I taught as a global seminar with video conferencing was a class on 20th and 21st century US immigration and migration narratives. I taught it with a colleague who I have been in conversation with and whose research I know well. What was really interesting about this particular class is she was teaching it at an Israeli university that's a very multi-ethnic, very diverse class. In both cases, we were working with roughly similar sized classes. My class had about 12 students. Her class, I think, had 15 students. And the size of the class ended up working really well. It facilitated the environment of discussion. And it also allowed opportunities for our students to learn about one another quite a bit more than if it had been larger classes. So we did both individual discussions between the students. We also did large and small group discussions across the classes. We had opportunities to get to know one another and why we were interested in the particular topics of immigration and migration in 20th and 21st century narrative.
I'd like to talk a little bit about designing discussion questions and how we basically let discussion happen in these courses. It's typically for us a combination of large group discussion, then some breakout sessions for the students to pair up on their own, and then to come back to the large group. Just in terms of designing those things, I think it's important to try as much as possible to give the students compact things to talk about in their pair work based on the readings, so that they have time to get to know each other as well as come to some conclusions about what the reading is or should be about, and then come back and share it with the group.
Yeah, one of the things that we found really helpful was creating a fairly consistent structure from class to class. So one of the things that I found that my students really responded to is that as the format was more or less regular, they tended to know what to expect. And so they eased up a little bit on what at times felt a little bit anxiety producing or kind of confused about when to talk and who should talk first, and the structure of working with international students and collaborators who were across the screen. Our structure was that we started with a brief lecture, usually setting the terms of the conversation for that day. My faculty partner and I tried to be as transparent as we could about what we wanted the class that day to accomplish. So we would usually set out some goals. In most cases, we found it to be very helpful to try to figure out for ourselves also in advance of the class meeting what our goals were. So we would try to balance what we thought our students were trying to get out of that day's reading with what we needed as instructors to assess and what we needed the class to accomplish that day. And typically speaking, we would have a very brief kind of substantive lecture, and we traded off those lectures, the other instructor and I. And then we would have a period of time where the full classes would discuss with each other. So we would do a sort of lecture format, introduction, then a discussion format with both classes meeting together, freewheeling, open-ended, improvisational, hoping some sparks would fly. And then at a non-predetermined point, we just would figure out kind of through guesswork a moment to break out into small groups. And for our class, what worked really well was mostly either one-on-one or two-on-two discussions across video conferencing software where the students could get to know each other a little bit and start to work through questions that we had given them. We gave them pretty clear directions. Then the third section would be the classes regrouping, and the pairs or the small groups would debrief the larger classes about what they had discussed, what insights they had come to, things that surprised them. And then if there was an option, if there was time at the end, we would try to figure out a way to have sometimes a little bit of sum up.
A lot of your priorities going into it are similar to the ones that I have with my colleague as well. And I think one of the ways that we try to deal with trying to get them to do so much in so little time, which is especially difficult if you have cultural differences, some language barriers, is again to try to keep the assignments the tasks somewhat compact. And one of the ways that we try to allow creativity into that process, just as you've described, is to try to make the tasks flexible. And to balance that, of course, we try to have the outcomes very specifiable. You have to pretty much end up with a recommendation for or vice versa. You know, it's very possible to have very specific parameters for discussion and then have kind of flexible outcomes. So that's basically how we do it. And I also think that it's important when the students are talking, once they are paired, once they are in their smaller group discussing the reading, they're not only trying to discuss the reading, but also to get to know each other. It almost is more important to find out what your partner does when he or she is not in school, what kind of music that they like, what they spend their money on, what their day is like, what they eat. And all that is kind of mixed in with discussing this reading. And it's kind of nice that they have the Skype, because they Skype each other outside of these times too.
Yeah, we tried to balance, the students were really interested in getting to know one another. So we tried to balance time where they were able to exchange life notes with time when they were also able to engage the substance of what we were asking them to read together, discuss it, and kind of find their own viewpoints into it. One of the real benefits of having U of M students be able to talk to international students outside of the country, is that in a lot of cases, the same question about the same reading will provoke completely different responses. That also produces some challenges. One of the challenges is that, and this is field specific, but in an English class, the students at U of M had a kind of built-in advantage because the texts were written in English, we were discussing them in English, and we were trying to avoid a hierarchy where the students who had English as a first language were more empowered and were more kind of comfortable than the students for whom English was a second or third or fourth language, when actually they were the students who very frequently had the insights. Because they were coming to this material without taking for granted the things that some U of M students or English speakers might take for granted. So we had to kind of work back and forth a little bit with trying to figure out how to privilege sometimes students who didn't necessarily feel authorized to speak, One of the ways that we did that is and this is kind of also one of the pedagogical innovations that we created on the fly without planning to. So some things you can plan for,
Sure.
some things just come up. So one thing that we developed is my colleague had this great idea that I think she just innovated, I think she just improvised, where she started calling on my students from across the screen, because she got to know their names fairly quickly, and she saw them with their hand raised or at the edge of their seat trying to get into the conversation. And so she started calling on my students, and then I started calling on her students. And what that created was more comfort across the screen divide, and much more awareness that we were really interested in hearing each other speak extemporaneously, and sometimes even a little bit off script. And it was great, because then there was much more exchange that in the small groups that could kind of build larger conversations about their interests. And in many cases, the fact that students in one national cultural linguistic context see things that students at U of M don't see created all kinds of really great conversations that we didn't see coming at all.
Shall we talk a little bit about technology?
Yeah, one of the things that's really ideal about the fact that technology now makes possible accessibly and less expensively the kinds of exchanges that previously I think were very, very difficult to pull off. There are still some technological challenges. Tech is not perfect, and I think in every class meeting that we did video conferencing, there was some issue with Wi-Fi or with some sort of slowdown, or sometimes there was a feedback with sound. So there were always unexpected challenges to negotiate. One of the real benefits here at U of M is that we benefited from the support that ISS and other offices on campus allowed, where they basically helped us with the planning process. They were with us in the classroom while the teaching was happening, and they provided follow-up afterwards during the course of the semester to figure out if something had gone awry in one class, to make sure how that wouldn't show up again in the next class. So technology-wise, things were a lot easier than I expected. I didn't come to the class with the kind of tech knowledge that I would have needed to have pulled this off myself, but the support was really invaluable. And as the semester went on, my experience was that the technology became less and less obvious. I just forgot about it in some cases. I mean, in the best of circumstances, when the discussion was happening between us and the students abroad, it just felt like we were having a conversation, and I think we all kind of forgot about it. In the individual small group conversations, it was a little bit harder to forget. There, it was a little bit more obvious that we were using those forms of technology.
I did also have a similar experience with the support staff here, because I was very concerned that I would pretty much be on my own, and what if this didn't work, or what if this failed? And it just seems to me that the support staff not only assists you with all the technology logistics of doing this course, they're also interfacing with the technologist in the remote location. And they're encountering all the language differences and everything else. As a matter of fact, if it weren't for the support staff here, I would have not known what to do when daylight savings time ended, and we were an hour, later or earlier or whatever. Yeah, and they were able to help just well in advance for virtually everything. And it's really quite thrilling to get into a classroom and see your table, your discussion table, come all the way up to the screen and then end. And then you look at the screen and you see the beginning of a table, their table, and it's like you're sitting at one big table. Now, one thing that I found that was really an interesting use of technology was that we wanted to have the cameras pulled back enough so that we could be sitting in like a horseshoe. And when we saw the German side of the table, they were all sitting like in a row, like American Idol judges, facing us. And I thought to myself, well, that's logical. The Germans are so logical. And we changed. We ended up sitting in a row just like them, facing them, because it was just so much more efficient. But at first we had this idea of kind of conversational coziness, that we wanted to show that we were listening to each other by facing each other, but it actually got in the way of us facing them. So we were kind of protecting ourselves. So it took a little time to figure out exactly how to do that. And I do agree with your point about language and the natural advantage that we have because our collaborators have been gracious enough to agree to do the seminar in English. And most of the adjustments for me is pace. My German colleague has got, Andreas Lehmann-Wurmser, he's gotten very good at just going like this to me, slow down, slow down, slow down. And sometimes when his students want to respond and they don't know exactly how to put it into words, he'll say to them in German, just say it to me in German, and they'll say it to him in German, and he'll say it in English to us. And rather than that just completely slowing down things right on the spot tends to accelerate things when German students then seem to gain more confidence with English as the lesson ensues.
One thing also that was very relevant to our discussions is that since the class that I was teaching was on immigration and migration narratives, there was a built-in interest and expectation that they would care about what students who were coming from different national, linguistic, cultural context, how they read these texts and what they thought about them. So while it was US literature and that built-in advantage was there, on the other hand, they were just incredibly excited to hear what students from a different national context thought about US immigration issues. And it's such an intensely kind of engaging issue these days, and it's so much in the news, that the students found that even when we were discussing early 20th century or other time periods, there was just relevance all the way throughout.
Yeah, I wonder if we can just talk for a few minutes about balance, since it seems to be emerging and what we're talking about. This whole idea of, for instance, language. We having the upper hand, so to speak, with English. It is, I think, really important to try and give time for adjustment. And I also think that it's not just language that's affected, it's also just beliefs about what learning should be and who's responsible for learning and how it should occur and when, and from whom. You know, I mean, do you listen to your teachers or do you tell them what you think? And you know, it's all different. I think it's important to talk about what the specific assignment is and how it resonates with American versus German students, in my case. From the evaluations that we did of the course after it was completed, we discovered that the German students were actually very frustrated at the amount of reading that American students are required to do. What's with all the reading? That's a lot of reading. There's not really room for my ideas here. There's so much reading. And that was a little bit difficult for me to have my students here, but it was, I think it's important. And also there's this idea, at least in American education, that primary sources are very important. If you want to learn about the writings of John Dewey, you read John Dewey. But the German students were quite happy reading summaries of, synopses of the work of John Dewey, et cetera. So I think it's important to try to take those things and see how you would redesign a lesson so that you can somehow balance the characteristics and beliefs of American students with German students.
Yeah, I found balance to be an absolutely essential tool in a lot of ways for trying to figure out, in certain instances, how to negotiate the needs of the students there and the students here, how to negotiate the needs of my colleague and mine. There were all sorts of circumstances where one kind of answer wouldn't work for the other students, or one method or one practice. So one of the things that we ended up doing was figuring out a way. We too had an issue with the pace of readings. The students abroad found the readings to be lengthy, intense, at times challenging, and we actually did slow things down, because one of the things that we found to be most productive was the actual interchange. And so students would say more in some cases if we gave them the right balance of readings. So if we gave them too little, there wasn't enough to work with, but if we gave them too much, they found themselves overloaded and kind of stressing about how much they had to cover and not getting to the interesting stuff. And in a lot of other cases too, we had to figure out ways to balance between the different needs of each class.
Yeah, I also think that allowing time for interpretation is really important. It's no big deal for German students to spend 2 or 3 hours in an afternoon sitting with a professor and having coffee and just talking about an idea. But typically you don't do that in America because it's not work enough. And American students tend to be much more to the point. Here's the process, here's the problem at hand, and here's my solution. And then boom, you're done. So I think getting the students to be more reflective in their interactions with the German students and the German professor was a real challenge for us. But I think it was well worth taking.
Yeah, that's great. And then one of the other aspects of that really came up in our class is that on the one hand, we wanted to ensure that they had questions that were open-ended enough to create unexpected highways and byways, unexpected interpretations, opportunities for thinking through issues that hadn't come up previously. So we wanted to give them a little bit of freedom with open-ended questions. On the other hand, we tried to be transparent about our aims and try to give them a sense of what we were trying to accomplish. So between the two, it left open a lot of room for interpretation, and on the other hand, also a certain amount of direction and clarity about what we were trying to do there. So we also want to discuss in a variety of ways one of our overarching aims for these classes as a whole, which is cultural diversity. Cultural diversity is built into, in my experience, any class at U of M, because students are almost in every case, no matter what size the class is, students are always coming from different perspectives. Adding in international students coming from a different location, just increases the opportunities for learning about ways of reading, ways of thinking, processes, habits, experiences, histories. There's so much opportunity there for thinking through things that we might take for granted or might think have only one solution or one answer. So cultural diversity has become a really important component to all of the teaching that operates under this format.
So this whole idea that you mentioned of diversity of backgrounds translates into diversity of ideas about roles of learners and teachers. And there's this German concept that all my students have become very familiar with, and that is Bildung, which is essentially the idea that learners are in charge, they're responsible for their own development, as opposed to, say, the American system where teachers are actually prepared well in teacher preparation programs to learn how to motivate a variety of types of students and in a variety of circumstances, in a variety of subjects too. And so, motivation becomes one of your chief competencies as a teacher here, whereas in Germany, it's not really needed. People are expected to be self-motivating. And so you have quite a bit of difference in learning in Germany. And you also have to respect that some cultures are more homogeneous than others. Maybe the German system is more like it is because they have more homogeneity than American students. But at the very least, there are different concepts of roles of learners which have to be negotiated in the context of these global seminars.
One of the ways that we accomplish this in my class that seemed to work well is, and this has been true for other co-teaching I've done, is that sometimes my colleague and I would model the kinds of assertion and listening that we wanted them to also practice as well, which is a part of learning cultural diversity as well. So at times, one of us would take the role of advancing an interpretation and showing students that it's possible to develop, sometimes even in fairly complicated ways, how it is that we read a particular novel. And then the other one of us, the other colleague, would kind of jump in and say some version of, that's really interesting, and that reminds me of another interpretation that I have of this text, and would advance another one that's built into or responsive to the initial one. And so in kind of listening and then also asserting, we gave students opportunities to work on their own forms of argumentation. It also gave them a sense of the pluralism of readings that are possible with pretty much every text. Reading a text in a different context sometimes means that a completely different version of that text might emerge. So as each reading came up week to week, we gave students the opportunity to think about and sometimes even just listen to us work through how those interpretations could follow.
You know, it's interesting that you're bringing up all these subtleties of reading and discussing. One of the things that I have noticed is that there's a tendency, at least in American education, to paraphrase what someone has just said as a way of demonstrating that you value what they're saying and that you're listening. But I don't find that in the German students. And the American students don't see it in the German students. The German students are much more apt to say what they really feel from their own perspective after someone else has done that. So likewise, there's this kind of interplay between these two ways of demonstrating that you know and understand in relation to other people.
And sometimes it's also the basis for disagreement, because I was taught a long time ago that if you can't paraphrase the person you disagree with in a way that that person agrees, then you can't really have a basis for disagreeing or for articulating an alternative perspective. So sometimes being able to say what somebody else thinks is a way of modeling respect and modeling that you've listened. On the other hand, it can also be an opportunity for suggesting another interpretation or another approach. So I think one of the things that we've learned through this exchange is just how central discussion is, as well as how complicated sometimes it is to orchestrate the necessary demands in a classroom for how a good discussion can operate. Teaching discussion and leading discussion is definitely one of those experiences that I know for me, I just feel like I'm constantly relearning and doing in new ways. But I learned a lot from co-teaching through a global seminar, and I've taken away a lot of the tools that I learned there. So this has been a way for us to think about discussion experiences and pedagogies and dynamics, and we're very grateful to you for watching.
Thank you very much.